She was 21 years old, and in the way these things are sometimes quietly finalized, with an envelope and a firm handshake, she had just become homeless. We want you to settle in for this one. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because this is a story worth sitting still for. Nell Greer had grown up understanding that the forest could be read like a page of text if you knew the language. Her father, Owen Greer, had been a timber cruiser for the provincial survey. One of those careful, patient men who walked into the bush alone with a compass, a scale stick, and a field notebook, and came back weeks later with a precise accounting of what the land held. He could look at a stand of white pine and tell you, without touching a single tree, how many board feet it contained, whether the soil below would support a skid road in a wet spring, and where the nearest reliable water source would be in a dry summer. He had spent 20 years developing this knowledge, and he had given most of it to Nell. She was his only child. Her mother had died when Nell was 4, and so it was just the two of them in a small surveyor's cottage at the edge of Larkin's Mill, in the boreal country of northern Ontario, where the Canadian Shield pushed through the soil like old bones and the rivers ran cold and dark even in August. Owen taught her the way he knew how, by walking. He showed her how the moss on the north side of a granite boulder differed from the south, how a creek's direction could be read from the way the willows leaned, how to estimate a tree's age from the texture of its bark. The tool he always carried was a flat ashwood scale stick, no longer than a ruler, with a brass head marked with fine graduated lines for measuring log diameter at a distance. He kept it in his breast pocket, close to him, the way other men kept a pocket watch. When Nell was 12, he had carved her initials into the handle, NG, in small, deliberate letters. He died of a fever in the spring she turned 17. He was 43 years old. He left no debts and no property, only a modest insurance policy he had faithfully paid into for years. Nell was sent, kindly enough but without hesitation, to live with her father's older brother, Fletcher Greer, who ran a dry goods distribution operation out of a warehouse on the Mill Road on the south end of town. Fletcher Greer was a man who understood the world through columns of figures. He had a wife, Phyllis, who managed the household with the same brisk efficiency her husband applied to his ledgers, and a son, Vernon, who was being groomed to take over the family business. Nell was assigned a cot in the storeroom behind the kitchen and put to work almost immediately, keeping inventory, repackaging goods for the lumber camps, mending the burlap wraps that came back torn from handling. She was not mistreated, exactly. Fletcher fed her and kept her clothed and never raised his voice. But she understood from the beginning that she was a temporary arrangement, a line item that would eventually be closed out. In 4 years, no one in that household asked her what she wanted. No one asked her what she knew. The man who came closest to seeing her clearly was an old Finnish packer named Eero Hakala, who made his living hauling freight between Larkin's Mill and the outlying camps. He was in his 60s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had long ago made peace with the distance between things, and he had known Owen Greer in the old days. He recognized something in Nell, a way of watching, a tendency towards stillness in a world that rewarded noise. In the evenings when the warehouse work was done, he would sometimes sit with her on the loading dock steps and offer her things. How to read weather in the way clouds stacked over the shield. How to cross Muskeg without losing your boots. How to judge river ice by the sound it made underfoot in November. Small pieces of knowledge given without ceremony. She held each one carefully. 4 years passed this way. Then, on a Thursday morning in late September, the maples were already turned, that deep northern orange that comes like a declaration before the cold. Fletcher called Nell into his office. It smelled of tobacco and cedar and old paper. He stood behind his desk the way he always stood behind his desk, with the settled authority of a man who considered that piece of furniture a kind of fortress wall, and told her, in his precise, unhurried way, that things were changing. Vernon, he explained, was entering into a formal partnership with a merchant from Sudbury. The new arrangement would require restructuring of the operation, including the use of the storeroom. Nell's position, he said, looking not quite at her face, had been absorbed into the new structure. Phyllis would be managing household accounts directly going forward. There was no role that made sense for Nell in the new arrangement. He gestured to a plain envelope on the desk. Inside, he told her, was the sum of $94. $60 was what remained of Owen's insurance policy, which Fletcher had held in trust until she reached adulthood. The remaining $34 was what he considered fair compensation for 4 years of work. Calculated, she noted in the quiet of her own mind, at a rate of about $8.50 per year. He called it a fair accounting. He had the grace not to sound proud of it. Nell stood very still. She had watched her uncle for 4 years and understood that appealing to a man like Fletcher Greer was like knocking on a closed ledger. It would not open simply because you knocked. So she gave one clean nod, stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and walked out of the office without a word. Her footsteps were quiet on the pine floorboards. As she crossed the hall, left the house, and went to the storeroom to pack the few things that were genuinely hers. She owned very little: a wool coat, 2 dresses, her father's field notebook with its penciled tree tallies going back years, a pair of good boots. The last thing she placed in her canvas bag was the ashwood timber scale stick, its brass head cool and solid in her palm. She walked out of the Greer warehouse at first light the next morning and did not look back at it. The Dominion Land Registry office in Larkin's Mill was a narrow room sandwiched between a hardware store and a barber's, with a pine counter and a smell of damp filing boxes. The clerk on duty, a heavy-set man named Pollard with a red face and an expression of professionally managed disinterest, looked up from his newspaper when Nell came in and set her envelope on the counter. $94, he said, after she explained her purpose, could get her a survey lot in the eastern clay belt. Not particularly good land. Too much rock for cultivation. Or, he added, with the particular flatness of a man, presenting an option he expected to be refused, there was a 40-acre parcel out along the old Sable Creek logging spur. A railway line that hadn't seen a train since a fire took the timber camp at its terminus in 1902. He said this last part as though describing a burial plot. There was an old camp warden's cabin on the lot, or what remained of one. No one had filed on it in over a decade. He named the price, $91 for the deed and registration fees. He was offering her ruins at the edge of nowhere, and the slight smile at the corner of his mouth said he expected her to see it that way. Nell looked at the registry map spread across the counter and found the thin line of the Sable Creek spur running north from the mill road before bending east around a granite bluff and terminating in a small square marked camp. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at land, not for what it was, but for what it might hold. A line was never nothing. A line was intention. "I'll take it," she said. Pollard's expression shifted, not into respect, but into the mild surprise of someone whose expectations have been disrupted in a minor way. He shrugged, pulled the deed from the filing cabinet, and processed the paperwork. An hour later, Nell walked out of the registry office with $3 in her coat pocket and a folded deed that named her the owner of Lot 14, Sable Creek Survey, District of Nipissing. She bought a wedge of cheddar and half a loaf of bread with 2 of those dollars and began walking north along the old spur line. She found the cabin 2 days later, in the late afternoon, when the light was coming through the birch trees at a low angle and turning everything amber and quiet. It had been a sound structure once: squared log walls, a stone chimney at the north end, a plank door hanging at a tired angle from a single iron hinge. The roof had partially collapsed on one side where a fir had come down across it, and the floor inside was packed earth gone damp and soft with years of neglect. But the chimney was intact. The corner logs were solid. The bones of the place were good. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the light change on the granite outcropping beyond the tree line. This was hers. In 4 years, nothing had been hers. She felt the weight of that settle over her. Not like a burden, but like an anchor finding solid ground for the first time. She began the work of reclamation the next morning, and she began with the chimney. A sound hearth was the foundation of a livable winter shelter, and this one needed to be cleared and tested before she could trust it in the cold. She chipped away at the old ash inside the firebox with a flat stone, working down through layers of hardened soot until she reached the original granite surface beneath. The chimney was local stone, fitted together with clay mortar that had dried to the hardness of old bone but was still basically sound. When she reached the base of the firebox and began clearing debris from the hearthstone, a single broad slab of gray granite, larger and flatter than the stones surrounding it, she noticed something. The other stones were set in mortar. This one sat in dry sand. She pressed the edge of her father's timber scale stick into the gap and felt it give. Her hands were steadier than she might have expected. She worked the brass head of the scale stick into the seam and used it as a lever, pressing down on the ash handle. The stone shifted with a dry, grating sound, and she pressed again, and it lifted. Beneath it was a hollow space, no larger than a bread box, lined with sheets of birch bark fitted carefully to keep the moisture out. Sitting inside the hollow was a tin tobacco box sealed around its lid with waxed canvas. She lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. Inside the tin, packed with the care of someone who intended things to keep, were 3 items. On top sat a woman's sewing thimble, silver, worn smooth on one side from long use. Beneath it lay a folded letter, written in small, careful script on paper gone brown at the edges. And under both of these, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with cotton string, was a bundle she unwrapped to find $280 in bills and coin. More money than she had ever held in her hands in her life. She sat back on her heels, her breath held tight, and stayed very still. Then she picked up the letter. To whoever finds this. My name is Temperance Rudd. I came to this cabin in 1898 with my husband Calvert, who served as camp warden for the timber operation at the end of this line. He died in the fire of 1901, and this place became mine alone to keep. I am leaving this money because I have no one left to give it to. I traded dried fish and smoked goods with the people further up this line for 17 years, and I saved what I could. It was meant for my daughter in Fort William, but she stopped writing 7 years ago, and I have made my peace with that. I am an old woman now, and I am going to my sister's house in Sault Ste. Marie to see out my last years. Whoever you are and whatever brought you to this forgotten place, I pray this money gives you a foundation. Good stone for chinking can be found in the creek bed, half a mile east. The clay along the north bank mixes well for mortar. Watch the ice on the river carefully in November. It speaks before it breaks, if you are patient enough to listen. If you need more than what you can find on your own, follow the spur line north for 6 miles, past where the track bends around the granite bluff. On the other side of the bluff, the land opens into a valley with a creek running through it. There are people there, good people who chose to be left off the maps, for reasons that are their own and that I will not put to paper. Tell them, Temperance Rudd sent you. They will understand what that means. I do not know who you are. I hope you find your footing here. I hope this forgotten place becomes home. Temperance Rudd, September 1915. Nell read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and set it back in the tin beside the silver thimble. She held the thimble in her palm for a moment, a small, worn circle, a record of 10,000 careful stitches by a woman she would never meet. A whole working life condensed into one small object. She understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was not the first person to arrive at this place with nothing and build something from it. Temperance Rudd had done it before her, in harder circumstances, and had thought carefully enough about whoever would come after that. She had left not just money but directions, not just capital but knowledge, not just means but a map to people. She placed the tin carefully inside her coat and walked out into the fading afternoon. The next morning she made the walk back to Larkin's mill, 8 miles, which felt shorter than it had 2 days ago, and went directly to the hardware and general store. She spent an hour filling a list she had been composing in her head since the night before: a claw hammer, a good crosscut saw, boxes of nails in 3 sizes, lengths of milled spruce for roof decking, tar paper, a small cast iron stove, flour, lard, dried beans, salt, oats, and a new kerosene lamp. She paid in bills, and the solid sound they made on the counter seemed to rearrange the air in the room. The store owner, who had not particularly noticed her the week before when she came in with $3, was now attentive and helpful. She found Eero Hakala at the livery stable, mending a harness with the unhurried attention he gave to everything. She told him what she needed: a haul to the old Sable Creek parcel, north, along the spur track. He looked at her quietly for a moment, at the packed supplies, at the deed she showed him. That's rough going this time of year, he said. The spur track's half buried. I know it, she said. My father surveyed the area in 1903. He nodded slowly, as though this settled something. He named a fair price and told her to be ready at first light. She was. The cabin took 3 weeks of hard work to become livable. She learned the weight of the crosscut saw, the way spruce boards wanted to split along the grain, the angle at which a hand plane worked best against the knots. She followed Temperance's advice about the creek stone and the clay bank, and she remortared the chimney base in sections, letting each section cure before moving to the next. She laid a proper plank floor and re-roofed the cabin one section at a time, tarring the seams while the weather still held. Her days had a shape to them now. Work from first light until she couldn't see, a simple meal, sleep without dreaming on her blanket roll. A week into the work, she followed Temperance's second set of directions. The spur line ran north through black spruce and tamarack, the rails half buried in encroaching moss and blueberry scrub. After what she estimated was close to 6 miles, the terrain changed. The granite bluff rose up on her left, a long, sweeping wall of rose-gray rock, and the track curved around its foot before ending abruptly in a tangle of collapsed ties. She followed the curve on foot, around the shoulder of the bluff. The valley on the other side was not large, but it was entirely sheltered. A pocket of land cupped between rock walls, threaded through by a quick, clear creek lined with trembling aspen already gone to gold. A dozen cabins stood along the creek, built of squared logs with sod roofs from which small garden plots trailed behind. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. She could hear the sound of children somewhere nearby, and the rhythmic ring of a hammer on metal. Her arrival was noticed immediately. A man splitting wood near the closest cabin set down his axe and watched her. A woman appeared in a doorway. Within a few minutes, a small group had gathered. 7 or 8 adults, their expressions careful and measuring in the way of people who had been found before when they did not wish to be. An older woman stepped forward from the group. She was perhaps 65, with silver-black braids and the kind of stillness that comes from long practice in difficult country. Her name, Nell would learn, was Odile Morisseau, and she had been born in this valley. "What brings you here?" Odile said. Her voice was level and not unkind. Nell held her ground. "My name is Nell Greer," she said. "I've just taken ownership of the old camp warden's cabin down the line. I was cleaning the hearth and found a letter from a woman named Temperance Rudd. She said to come here and give you her name." The effect was quiet but immediate. Something shifted in Odile's expression, not into warmth exactly, but into recognition. Around her, others exchanged glances. "Temperance," Odile said quietly. "Yes. We traded with her for many years. She was a good woman, honest." She studied Nell for a moment longer, then gestured toward the nearest cabin door. "Come and sit," she said. "Tell me your situation." Nell sat and told the shape of it. Not the money, but the rest. The uncle who had kept careful accounts, the deed bought with what little she had, the work already underway. The people of the valley listened. Odile listened most carefully. The community had been in that hidden valley for close to 40 years. Their grandparents had held scrip to land in the parkland belt further west. Land that a government surveyor had quietly remeasured and a speculator had absorbed through paperwork the original holders could neither read nor contest. Rather than scatter, 2 families had come north together, following a route that one of the grandfathers had mapped from memory, to a valley he had camped in once during a long winter traverse. They had built here. They had raised their children here. They had removed themselves from the official record, not out of shame, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the official record had never worked in their favor and showed no signs of starting. Nell did not ask for help, but help was offered in the practical way of people who understood what it took to survive a boreal winter on your own. A man named Solomon Tate, who ran the settlement's small forge, noticed the blade of Nell's timber scale stick. She had been using it as a draw knife for splitting cedar shingles. He examined the edge without comment, took the stick to the forge, and returned it an hour later with an edge that would take the finest shaving off a piece of birch bark without tearing. He handed it back without ceremony. Before Nell walked back down the spur line that first evening, Odile Morisseau pressed a birchbark basket into her hands, dried cranberries and smoked whitefish wrapped in a clean cloth. "A person can't build a roof on flour and resolve alone," Odile said. This was said plainly as a fact, in the way she said most things. Over the autumn and into early winter, Nell became a quiet thread between the valley and Larkin's mill. With Temperance's money, she could purchase what the valley needed: salt, lamp oil, sugar, certain tools that required a larger forge than Solomon's. Iro Hakala hauled goods to the cabin, and from there they made their way north on foot. In return, the valley gave her things that couldn't be bought at the hardware store. Odile taught her which roots could be boiled against a chest fever. Solomon showed her how to bank a fire for a night that dropped to 30 below so it would still be breathing at dawn. A quiet young woman named Iris, who seemed to move through the forest as though she had been born there, which in a sense she had, taught her to set a rabbit snare that worked even in deep snow. She finished the cabin in October. The walls were tight, the floor was level, the stove sat solid on its slate base. The door fit square in its frame and latched against the wind. It was small, 14 feet by 12, but it was warm, and it was right, and every part of it was something she had built with her own hands from what others had discarded. When the first real snow came down from the north, and the spruce trees bent under its weight, Nell Greer had a home. One evening in November, with the lamp burning low and the stove settled into its steady, quiet heat, she sat at the table she had built from leftover spruce boards and looked at the two things placed side by side in the lamplight. One was her father's timber scale stick, the ash wood worn smooth from his years of carrying it, the brass head still engraved with his careful gradations, her initials still there in the handle where he had cut them when she was 12. NG. The other was the birchbark basket Odile Morisseau had given her on that first visit, woven in a pattern of repeating diamonds that suggested great patience and a long sense of time. Two objects. Two people who had cared for a future they would not see. Her father, who had walked into the bush for 20 years, with that stick in his breast pocket, teaching her to read a land that most people passed through without understanding. And Temperance Rudd, who had spent 17 years alone in a forgotten cabin, saving money in a tin box for a stranger she would never meet, and had taken the trouble, had taken the care, to leave not just funds but directions, not just a foundation but a map to people, not just means but a way through. She thought of Fletcher Greer, sitting behind his desk with his careful columns. He had looked at her and seen a cost. He had looked at a piece of paper that said Lot 14, Sable Creek Survey, and seen nothing worth acquiring. He had handed her $94 and considered the matter closed. He had never learned what her father knew. That a line on a map was not nothing. That a line on a map was intention. That a logging spur running north into the boreal forest and ending at a fire-scared clearing was not a line to nowhere. It was a line to exactly here, to this lamp, to this warmth, to the sound of snow settling against a tight-fitted door that she had hung herself. The rusted rails of the Sable Creek spur had not led nowhere. They had led her home. We hope this story found you well tonight. If it stayed with you, we'd ask you to share it with someone who might need it, someone who has been told that a thing is worthless and hasn't yet discovered what's underneath. And before you go, we'll leave you with one question to carry into your week. What has someone left for you? A lesson, a small kindness, a quiet piece of useful knowledge that they never expected you to remember. Sometimes the people who shape us most profoundly are the ones who never knew they were doing it at all.